I don't know about you, but that music gets me a little hyped up here today. Welcome to Compass. Our mission is navigating people to God. As Anthony just said, next week you're not going to want to miss it. It's student takeover weekend. It's going to be great. And so invite someone you know to be a part of it as well. It's going to be an awesome weekend together. Well, welcome. My name's Nate. I'm one of the pastors here at Compass North Fort Worth, and we're so glad that you're worshiping with us wherever that might be from. In fact, right now in the comment section, we'd love for you to just drop where you're worshiping from. We want to say hi to you. We just want you to know we're glad that you're here. And if you're a guest, if this is maybe your first time, we'd love to connect with you. And the best way to connect in this season is either you can fill out the digital connection card that our chat hosts are putting in the comment section right now, or you can text the word Connect NFW to 94000. Someone from our team is going to reach out to you. Hey, we have a gift that we want to send you. It's just our way of saying thanks for joining us. Plus, when you fill out that digital connection card, not only do you get a gift, but you get to give a gift as well, because every connection card that gets filled out, we donate 20 meals to people in need in our North Fort Worth area. So we're glad that you're here. We're glad that you're worshiping with us today. Well, as we begin today, I want you to think about this, okay? Have you ever had one of those moments where maybe someone told you what to do, like maybe it was trying to help you get from where you are to where you want to be? I think we've all had those moments, haven't we? Maybe for some of you, you've done something like financial peace, and Dave Ramsey has said, these are the things that you've got to do to get from where you are, out of debt, to where you want to be debt-free. Or maybe you've gone to counseling and your marriage counselor has said, these are the steps that you've got to take to get from where you are in your marriage to where you really want to be. Or maybe it's when it comes to parenting, or maybe it's with your habits, or maybe the addictions that you have, or maybe it's with your health that somebody's told you, these are the things you've got to do to get to where you want to be. The fact is this. Somebody somewhere knows what you need to do to get to where you want to be. Somebody knows the steps that you need to take and how you need to get to that place. But there's a problem, isn't there? And the problem is this: despite the fact that there are people who know what to do and they can tell us what to do to get to where we want to be, a lot of times the problem is that we don't want to listen to the advice of other people. In fact, we will resist the advice of other people, or we will just push back. You know, in my house, in the Grella household, we have 4 very strong-willed, leader-type personalities. And sometimes when I tell my kids to do something, they don't like what I'm telling them to do. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, my son Blake and I, we were out in the driveway, and he was working on his jump shot, and we were just trying to make him an even better shooter than he already is. And as we were working on the shot, I was like, just work on this little thing. He didn't like what I was telling him. You see, one of the reasons why I don't think he liked what I was telling him is because he's been beating me in basketball in the driveway, like one-on-one over the last few weeks. And so he thinks that he knows everything now, and he doesn't remember that I'm still the Jedi Master when it comes to basketball. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to put him in his place right now. And so what I did is I was like, hey, I'm going to make you a deal. If I make 3 shots in a row from Steph Curry range, then I'm still the Jedi and you're still the Padawan. And he kind of laughed at me, and he shook my hand though, and he took the deal. And so I went back to where that spot was where Steph Curry shoots from, and I shot the first one, swish, nothing but net. I got the ball back from him. I took another shot. The next one kind of bounced around, but it went in, 2 for 2. I had one more shot to take. I'll be honest, I was a little bit nervous with this third shot because I was like, man, if I miss this, then I'm never going to hear the end of it. So I stepped back, I took the shot, I breathed in, the ball went up, it arced for a while, but it came down, swish again, nothing but net, and the crowd went wild in the neighborhood, or at least they did in my mind. And I looked at Blake and I put my hands in the air and I was like, see, that's how you do it right there. Like, I am Obi-Wan, you're still Anakin Skywalker. You need to listen to what I'm saying, because even though you got skills, I still got skills too. And there's a reason why it had got to that point. You see, he didn't think he needed me telling him what to do anymore. And let's face it, we all have that same tendency, don't we? Like we don't like being told what to do, even if the person that's telling us what to do knows what they're talking about or even has the right motives about them. And honestly, Some of you, you don't even have to think past yesterday about ignoring the advice of somebody else. Do you know anybody like this? I know people like this who don't listen to anybody else, but I've never done that in my life. Okay, I'm just kidding. Have you ever had one of those moments where you find yourself arguing with someone you love or someone you respect? You know they're right, but you argue with them anyway, and you keep arguing until you win, but you don't get really any closer to where you want to be. When you think about that, it's really crazy, isn't it? Because through this series, what we've been talking about is we're talking about this idea of where we are right now and where we want to be. It's not where somebody else wants us to be. No, it's where we want to be. And most of the time, the problem is this. We are our own worst enemies because we resist the advice that we should embrace. The reason we resist, because it's coming from somebody else, right? In fact, some of you, there's a reason why you don't like going to church. There's a reason why you've resisted attending church for a long time. And look, I totally get it as a pastor. I understand. I'm not even offended by it. I realize that some of you just don't like being told what to do by somebody else. And ladies, listen to this for a minute. There's a reason why when you, maybe after church, you go, man, wasn't that a good message? Your husband or your spouse or your boyfriend goes, it was okay. The reason is, we as guys, we don't like being told what to do by other guys. And maybe the reason he said, it was okay is because he's like, did you see what Pastor Nate was wearing? He's got those skinny jeans on. He's got those Air Jordans on. There's no way I'm listening to that guy. And this is something that we all do. This isn't just guys that do this. Some of you have probably done this right after a message. Maybe you've heard something, it was really convicting to you, and you're like, man, that was so good. But then you begin to think about it and process it, and what happens is you start editing, or you start tweaking, or you go man, it was good, but I don't think that's what Pastor Nate meant to say. Or I think what he was actually trying to get at is this. Have you ever done something like that before when it comes to a message? Maybe you're doing that right now. I know I'm guilty of this because sometimes I have a hard time taking the advice of others. Or have you ever done something like this? Like maybe you prayed to God, God, would you show me, and you fill in the blank, whatever it is. And you're like, God, why are you not showing me this? And God's saying to you, I did show you. I showed you through your spouse. I showed you students through your parents. I showed you through that coworker, but you just didn't listen to what they had to say. There's a story in Scripture that is so good when it comes to this, and I want to dig into that with the rest of our time today. If you've got a Bible or a Bible app, I want you to turn with me to the book of 1 Kings. We're going to be at 1 Kings chapter 12 today. Now, if you grew up in the church, you might have heard this story, but my guess is that maybe this is a story that is new to some of you as well. But it's a story that I think can all help us get to this place where we move from where we are to where we want to be. It's a story about a guy who undermines his own success because he fails to listen to the advice of others who are trying to give him really good advice. Now, I want to give you a little bit of context into this story so you understand where we're at. You see, before we can get to understanding what's happening in this story, we have to go all the way back to this promise that God makes to a guy named Abraham. Now, if you remember from a few months back, we talked about the promise that God made to Abraham. He said, Abraham, if you will be faithful, then I will make your family this great nation, and you will be a blessing to all the other nations in the world. And so Abraham, he agrees, and so God and Abraham, they set up this covenant where God's gonna kind of rule, he's gonna reign, he's gonna be kind of like the king. He's gonna set the laws and decrees of the people of Israel, this nation that is created. And this is how things roll for a while. But what happens over time is that the Israelite people, they begin to notice that all these other neighboring nations, the problem is they see all of them have these earthly kings ruling them, and they think to themselves, maybe we should do this too. Maybe we should give up on having God be the one to rule us, which honestly was a terrible idea. This is one of those moments, my mom would say, if everybody else is jumping off the cliff, would you jump off the cliff? Well, that's one of these moments, and the Israelites jump. And so God, he agrees to this request that they make, and he sets up these earthly kings to rule them. The first king of Israel is this guy named Saul. After Saul, and Saul rules for about 40 years. After Saul, there's another guy, a guy named David, who rules the Israelite people. You've probably heard of David. He's the guy who defeated Goliath, and David rules. He's a really good king. And then after David, his son takes over, this guy by the name of Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man to have ever lived. We've talked about and read some of his words over these past few months, haven't we? Well, Solomon, after Solomon, it's his son that takes the throne, and his name is Rehoboam. Now, you gotta love that name, right? Rehoboam. It was one of the names that we were choosing for our son. We were trying to decide. I'm kidding. We didn't choose that name. But it's important to remember Rehoboam's name, because as we talk about him in this story today, there's another Boam in this story. His name is Jeroboam. Now, clearly, back in that day, Boam, names ending in Boam, was a popular thing. And so, anyway, Jeroboam, he's the other guy in the story. But he isn't related to Rehoboam. He's not related to Solomon. He's actually just an Israelite who grows up in the Israelite army, and he rises through the ranks, and he gets noticed by Rehoboam's father, Solomon, as this guy who is skilled with leadership and administrative skills. And so Solomon ends up putting Jeroboam in charge of all the forced labor for the Israelite people. Now, Solomon, he was building buildings. He loved to build buildings. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact, and I said he was the smartest man to have ever lived. I think it had to do with the fact that he was building homes and palaces and buildings for his 700 wives and 300 concubines. That, to me, does not seem the smartest thing to do. And so Jeroboam is actually in charge of this forced work laborers. And there's about 150,000 in total. So knowing that, you begin to understand how skilled and how organized Jeroboam had to be. Well, somewhere along the way, what happens is there is this rumor that gets started that when Solomon passes away, that Jeroboam is going to try to take the kingdom next. He's going to try to become king, not Rehoboam. And Solomon gets word of this, and this is really not good. And Jeroboam knows that, and he knows that he's being looked at as a traitor, so he does the smart thing. He gets out of Dodge as quick as he can. He goes into hiding in Egypt, and he tries to get away because he didn't want to die by false rumor. Well, that's kind of the Cliff Notes version that gets us to 1 Kings chapter 12. And so we get to 1 Kings chapter 12, and we find out Solomon has died, and now Rehoboam is about to be appointed the king of Israel. And this is what we read starting in verse 1 here. This is the words that we read about this story. Rehoboam went to Shechem, where all Israel had gathered to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of this, he returned from Egypt, for he had fled to Egypt to escape from King Solomon. The leaders of Israel summoned him, and Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel went to speak with Rehoboam. Your father was a hard master, they said. Lighten the harsh labor demands and heavy taxes that your father imposed on us, and then we will be your loyal servants. So after Solomon's death, we're at this point where Rehoboam, he's about to be appointed the king. And Jeroboam, who's still living in Egypt, he hears this, and this is like good news to him. And so he's like, finally, I can head back home because they won't see that I am trying to overthrow the king anymore. And so he heads back. And when he gets back, the people of Israel, they're so excited to see Jeroboam because he was kind of like a folk hero of sorts. And so the people of Israel, they go to Jeroboam and they're like, hey, maybe you can help us convince Rehoboam to lighten the load. And you catch what it says there in verse 4, that they go to Rehoboam and they're like, if you will lighten the load, if you will take away these harsh taxes and all this labor that your dad placed upon us, this burden that is on us, then we will be your loyal servants forever. They were like, this country is in a state of turmoil, and you have a chance to change things. Now, I want you to catch how Rehoboam responds here. Verses 5 to 7, this is what it says next. It says, Rehoboam replied, give me 3 days to think this over. Then come back for my answer. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam discussed the matter with the older men who had counseled his father Solomon. "What is your advice?" he asked. "How should I answer these people?" The older counselors replied, "If you are willing to be a servant to these people today and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your loyal subjects." Now, Rehoboam, he actually makes two really good decisions here. The first decision, he's like, before I say anything, I need some time. I need to think about this. And then the second decision that I think is really good that Rehoboam makes, and we need to think about this in our own lives, is he says, let me get some advice. And so what we read here in 1 Kings 12 is that Rehoboam goes to his father's advisors, these elders, and he goes, "Hey, the people have come to me and they're saying that I should lighten the load. What do you think that I should do?" And their response is simple. They say, "You should definitely lighten the load." Actually, I find it interesting what they say. Look again at what it says here in verse 7. It says, "The older counselors replied, 'If you are willing to be a servant to these people today and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your loyal subjects.'" They're telling him, look, Rehoboam, if you want to get from where you are, you want to get from here to where you want to be this king that the people follow, this one that they will always honor and be loyal to, then you need to lighten the load. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, man, this is wisdom here. This is really good advice. But guess what? When I read this, I realize that Rehoboam is a lot like you and I. You see, despite good counsel, despite wise advice from those that he's listened to, he chooses not to listen. The problem is, it's exactly what he needed to hear, but it's not what he wanted to do. I mean, he wanted a united kingdom, but he wanted it in his own way. He wanted it the way he had in his mind. And this is what we've got to understand. Direction, not intention, determines destination. See, Rehoboam got direction from his father's elders, but his intentions were different, so he rejects and ends up heading in a different direction, and his destination that we will see is not where any of us would want to be. But let's be honest. I mean, how many of us are really surprised by this? I mean, he's the king, right? He's the guy who is in charge. He doesn't have to take advice from anyone. He should be the one who is offering up advice. He is the one making these decrees and offering these edicts. That's what kings do. But you see, this is the trap. Not just for Rehoboam. I think it's a trap for each and every one of us, because just like Rehoboam, in our own lives, we have our own free will, our own choices. We are our own king, our own queen of our lives. And when we do what we want to do, what happens is we generally end up where we don't want to be. Think about that for a minute. It might explain why some of you've got a stack of credit card bills and the debt is piling up. Maybe it's why your marriage is hanging on for dear life. Maybe it's why the relationship with your kids is strained. Maybe for some of you, it's why your health is a mess. You see, when we do what we want to do, it generally leads where we don't want to be. Now, I want to go back to Rehoboam's story, because this is where he's at. This is what ends up happening. Look at what happens next, starting in verse 8. It says, "But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the older men. Instead, he asked the opinion of the young men who had grown up with him and who were now his advisors," which is a really bad idea, right? And he says this, he says, "What is your advice? How should I answer these people who want me to lighten the burdens imposed by my father?" And the young men replied, "This is what you should tell these complainers who want a lighter burden. My finger is thicker than my father's waist. Yes, my father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips. I will beat you with scorpions." I think this is where Rehoboam makes a fatal flaw. He rejects the wisdom of the elders for the wisdom of his friends. And these guys give him some terrible advice, don't they? Like as I'm reading this and I'm imagining this scene taking place, like Rehoboam comes to his friends. He's like, guys, the people want me to lighten the load. What do you think that I should do? And this is what I think they were like. They were like, bruh, no way, man. Like don't lighten the load, bro. Like make it harder on a man. Whip him with the scorpions, bro. That's what you need to do. And I don't know why they sounded like surfers, but when I read it, that's what they sounded like. And that's what good old Rehoboam wanted to hear. But you see, therein lies the problem, and I think is the lesson that we learn. When you hear what you want to hear and you do what you want to do, it lands you where you don't want to be. So knowing that then, why do we choose that direction? Why did he choose that direction? I would say that sometimes it's because of ego. Sometimes it's ignorance, it's pride, it's stubbornness. It'd be a combination of all these things. And what happens is we undermine our own success, or even worse, we undermine our ability to discern God's will for us and where he wants us to be. You see, the things that we wish for ourselves, a better family, a better marriage, our finances to be in order, whatever it might be, hear this, God wants that for you as well. The problem is we undermine those things sometimes because of our ego, because of stubbornness, because of ignorance. And I think this is where Rehoboam is at. He's like, I'm the king. I tell people what to do. You don't tell me what to do. Oh, and by the way, asking for a lighter burden, no, I am going to make it harder on all of you. And let's face it, like this is not a good way to get a whole bunch of people to follow you in your leadership, is it? What it actually does is it just ticks the people off more, because catch it what it says. We're going to skip ahead to verse 16. It says this: when all of Israel realized that the king had refused to listen to them, they responded, down with the dynasty of David. We have no interest in the son of Jesse. Back to your homes, O Israel. Look out for your own house, O David. So the people of Israel returned home. Now I'm reading this and I'm thinking to myself, oh snap, things are about to get real here, right? Like people, they are mad in this moment. And basically what they're saying to Rehoboam here is this: hey, Rehoboam, those buildings you want us to build, you can take them and shove them and I'll let you fill in the blank. There was probably a few other vulgar words they said there. Basically what they were saying is, we are done listening to you, and oh, by the way, we don't even recognize you as our king. This is what they tell Rehoboam, who is supposed to be appointed the king over all these 12 tribes of Israel. But what happens in this moment is the kingdom of Israel, it gets split. And it's not a 50-50 split. It's 10 tribes. They leave. They're like, we no longer see you as our king. They're like, we are done with you, Rehoboam. Now remember, he had gotten some really good advice from his dad's advisors, who told him, like, if you really want people to follow you, then lighten the load. But this decision is going to cost him. Instead, he takes the advice of his friends. He ends up ruling over only 2 of the 12 tribes. And you know, as I'm reading this, like I'm thinking, clearly Rehoboam didn't get the wisdom gene from his dad. Because the decision that he makes here is not smart. But as the text continues, what we read is that Rehoboam, he thinks, you know what? Fine, those people, I don't need them. I'll just find some other laborers. I'll find some other stone cutters and builders. And so look at what it says next. Verse 18, it says this. It says, King Rehoboam sent Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, to restore order. But the people of Israel stoned him to death. When this news reached King Rehoboam, he quickly jumped into his chariot. He fled to Jerusalem. I think the message is loud and clear here, isn't it? The people are not following Rehoboam. And in this moment, this decision is one that changes Israel forever. It's still how Israel is to this day. It's split. There's a northern kingdom. As you read the Old Testament or even into the New Testament, there's a northern kingdom, there's a southern kingdom, there's Israel and Judah. And it's because of Rehoboam's decision not to take the good advice. The kingdom gets divided. Rehoboam, he rules over those 2 tribes. Well, those other 10 tribes, they need a king. Guess who they appoint as their king? The guy who was trying to avoid all this in the first place, Jeroboam. The kingdom was divided because one guy had stubbornness and ego and ignorance that he was allowing to control him, and he wasn't willing to listen to good advice. He was told, this is how you get from where you are to where you want to be, but he chose to ignore the wisdom. And here's the key from Rehoboam's story. There's someone who knows how to help you get from where you are to where you want to be. But the key is this: you have got to listen to good advice and not resist it. Because when we do, what happens is we undermine our own success as a father, as a husband, as a wife, as a mother, as an employee, as a CEO, as a son, as a daughter, whatever it might be. You know, as I've said from the very beginning of this series, what we have to understand is this, is that God has a wish for you. He has a wish for me. He wants to help us get from where we are to where we want to be. But we've got to be willing to listen when God speaks to us. And sometimes God speaks to us through others. Maybe God is speaking to you through someone. Maybe God has been using this series to speak to you. You've got to stop and you've got to listen to the good advice that God is trying to tell you. You know, as we wrap up today, I think there are two lessons that we can learn from Rehoboam's story. The first one is this: doing what you want to do won't get you where you want to be. Understand, if you're not where you want to be financially or relationally or professionally or physically or spiritually, whatever it might be, know that it might mean you need to look at your life and might need to go, you know what? Something is out of whack. Something needs to change. It might mean you have to do something that is maybe different than what you're doing right now. And that makes sense, doesn't it? But the problem is, I think sometimes we avoid that because we don't have the maturity that we need. It takes maturity to go, you know what? I got to stop doing this and I got to start doing this instead. Which means you got to be willing to forego something good now for the sake of something better later. Here's a really good way to understand this. You know, these last few months, I've been trying to get really healthy and eat better, and I've been working out. My wife Amanda and I, we've been watching the things that we're eating, and we get out and we work out. We get up every day and work out, and so I've been trying to be healthy ever since like all this kind of shut down. And so I got to work out every day, and I can't eat some of the things that I like to eat. And you guys that have been here for a while, you know what I like. I like those Krispy Kreme donuts, especially when the hot and ready light is on. And I love going to Brahms and getting ice cream. But here's the thing. There are days where I don't want to work out. There are days that's what I want to eat. But if I don't work out and the only thing I do is eat the stuff that tastes good in the moment but isn't really good for me, I'll never get where I want to be. And so the key is this: if you want to get to where you want to be, you might have to do some things now that you don't want to do. That's the first lesson from Rehoboam's story. The second lesson is this: somebody knows what you need to do to get to where you want to be. The key is to recognize there are others who have knowledge that can help you, that they can point you in the right direction, and honestly, you need to listen to them. For me, one of the people in my life is a guy by the name of Craig Brads. Craig is one of my best friends, and I think that God put Craig in my life because he knew that I was going to need it. Craig and I started working together. My first ministry, which I've shared, was a really difficult ministry. And I think God knew that I needed a guy like Craig who was going to speak wisdom to me as I went through ministry. Craig's about 15 years older than me, but he took me under his wing and he spoke wisdom to me at every crossroads that I came to. And he's someone that I know to this day, even though he's living in Ohio and here I am living in Texas, that I know that I can call up and he's going to help me take the right steps. And here's what I love about Craig. I know that Craig is going to tell me what I need to hear, not what I want to hear. That Craig knows where I want to be, and so he's not going to candy coat things. He's going to speak the truth in love, and I think that's what we need in all of our lives. We need people like a Craig Brads who will speak the truth when we need to hear it. You see, if there's anything that I can encourage you to do to get from where you are to where you want to be, it's this: seek someone out who is where you want to be. Find someone who has nothing to lose and isn't afraid to tell you the truth, and then ask them this question. Knowing what you know, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Now, here's my prayer for you as we wrap up this series. My prayer is that some of you would do more than just listen. My prayer is that some of you would take some steps, that you would take action. And so as we wrap up this series today, let me just give you two things. This is free advice, like no charge here. You're going to want to write this down and you're going to thank me for it later. Two things that you got to do to get from where you are to where you want to be. The first thing is this. Write down 3 things you wish you'd been doing all along and then start doing. And the second thing is this. Write down 3 things that hinder you from getting where you want to be and then stop. You see, doing is what makes all the difference. It's doing, not wishing. It's doing, not talking. It's doing, not planning that makes the difference. And if you're not sure what to do, then find that person like Craig Brad's is for me and say, hey, what would you do if you were in my shoes? How can I get from where I am to where I want to be? I wonder how different things would have been for Rehoboam if he had just listened to the advice of his father's elders. I think things would have been totally different. Proverbs 22:3 says this, a prudent person foresees danger and takes precautions. The simpleton goes blindly on and suffers the consequences. As the writer here in Proverbs says, I would encourage you, be prudent. Listen to what others have to say because somebody knows how to help you get from where you are to where you want to be. I think we all have a wish for our lives. We have this dream or these goals that we want, but we got to get from the wish to here. It means that we've got to take some steps. We got to take action. We got to be prudent. You know, my prayer is some of you, the step that you would take is that you would take the most important step that you could ever take in your life, and that is following Jesus. And if you've never done that, we want to talk to you. You can text the word Connect NFW to 9400 right now, and we'll reach out to you and we'll talk to you about how to take that next step. We want to help you. Or maybe you've got something that's going on in your life that you need prayer for. As we kind of wrap up this series, hey, just drop in the comment section right now, or you can text Connect NFW. We'll reach out to you that way. We want to know and we want to pray with you as we wrap up this series because we want to help you move from that wish in your life to where you want to be. Would you pray with me as we close out today? Father, we thank you so much that you are a God who will walk alongside of us, who will help us get from where we are to where we want to be. God, help us to listen to the words of others that maybe you speak through them to us. God, help us not to be afraid to take these risks in our life, the good risks that will help us get to where we want to be. God, I pray for those who maybe need to make that decision to follow you with their life. I pray that right now, wherever they're at, they would just text those words or they would just type in the chat section, I want to know more about following Jesus. God, whatever it is, God, that they would just have courage right now. God, for those who are hurting, for those who are going through a tough time in their marriage or maybe they're going through financial struggles, God, I just pray that you would help them take the necessary steps they need to get to where they want to be. God, we know that you promise that you will walk alongside us, that you'll never leave us, and we thank you for that promise. God, help us to follow you where you lead us. We pray these things in your name. Amen.